Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, whenever you are, whatever you are. Welcome to this week's podcast. Seeing as it's the end of October, I thought we'd take a deep dive into the wonderful world of ghost literature to give us a break from all the other horrors that we cover on this show. I hope you enjoy this one. It was but the breath of a whisper overheard. It was the hour when night visions breed disquiet as men lay chained in sleep. Fear took hold of me, a fit of trembling that filled my whole frame and made every hair bristle. All at once a spirit came beside me and stopped. There it stood, no face I knew, and yet I could see the form of it and catch its voice, light as the rustling breeze. This is not an extract from a recently discovered tale by Edgar Allan Poe, nor an excerpt from a story by, say, C.R. Maturin or Arthur Machen, but a passage from the Book of Job, composed somewhere between the 6th and 4th century BC, in Monsignor Ronald Knox's rendering. It continues magnificently with a series of momentous questions from the apparition, which are uttered in a whisper. It is a comparatively early instance of a ghostly experience in recorded literature. One might hazard a guess that ghost stories antedate literature and belong to a primordial world in the dark backward and abysm of time. It is a fact that in primitive religion, mythology, and ancient epics, the interrelationship of the living and the dead, the natural and the supernatural, is commonplace. All societies that hold animistic beliefs have been and are disposed to believe in ghosts. As Sir James Frazer and E.B. Taylor and others have shown, it is next to impossible to find societies which do not have such beliefs. Even when many members of a given society have rationalized them or repudiated them or merely allowed them to fall into disuse, the beliefs display a certain resilience and a tendency to linger on. Such beliefs pervade pre-Christian literature in Europe and in the Near and Middle East. From the 4th century onward, in the Patrologia Latina, a philosophical and moral treatise, in chronicles, in a collection of legends, exemplar, homilies and sermons, and in theological handbooks, as well as in a wide range of other didactic literature, and in an extensive variety of literature designed primarily to divert and entertain. There are numerous references to ghosts and anecdotes about them. From time to time, official and surprisingly scientific investigations were made into cases of alleged visitations by ghosts. There were even periodic instances of poltergeist, which much has been said and written about in the 20th century. The annals of the Abbey of Fulda, for example, contain an account of a farm near Bingen, which was haunted by an incendiary stone-throwing poltergeist in AD 858. When subjected to the ritual of exorcism, he struck some bystander, called the priest by name, and accused him of fornication. He also claimed to have taken cover under the priest's cassock, where he sprinkled holy water. As in this case, many ghostly activities and pranks were associated with demonic agency. In the literature referred to, there are many hundreds of stories of devilry and a very large number involving good spirits. For 1,000 years and more, the multifarious world of the supernatural was deemed to be contingent with the natural order, cheek by jowl with it, so to speak, as it has been in different modes and under different dispensations in pre-Christian times. Moreover, Christian precepts, doctrine and belief derive from the Old Testament, the Gospels and the Acts, confirming the existence of the supernatural order over and over again. The theological and philosophical works of metaphysicians ratified the teachings of the Church. The Son of God himself is the most illustrious ghost in history, to say nothing of the Holy Ghost. Christ was reported to have made no fewer than 11 appearances after the resurrection. You could hardly believe in the resurrection and not believe in ghosts. It is a wonder, perhaps, that the ghost story, as we understand it today and have done for close on 200 years, at its simplest a work of fiction of indeterminate length about a place haunted by a spirit of some dead person, or a spirit that may or may not materialize in some shape or form, did not appear sooner. The word ghost itself is an old one. The Old English form is gast, denoting a soul or spirit. Equivalents were the Old Frisian Geist, the Old Swedish Geist, and the Old High German Geist. Until very early in the 19th century, most stories about ghosts were anecdotal, often with a basis on fact of some sort, and could not really be regarded as fiction in the way in which we now regard ghost stories of, say, Henry James or E.F. Benson. However, here and there we find quite striking examples of stories which are very near to being fiction, or are so wrought that they appear to approach the category. For instance, there is Lucian's tale of the haunted Sando in his satirical sketch on the pathological liar. In Petronius' Satyricon and Apelles' The Golden Ass, there are insect ghost stories which come near the modern form and idea. They are sophisticated and well constructed, and they are clearly intended to send a chill down the reader's spine. The beguiling Pliny the Younger too shows an interest in the ghost story. Writing to Licinius Sura, he says, "I should very much like to know whether you think ghosts exist, and have a form of their own and some sort of supernatural power, or whether they lack substance and reality and take shape only from our fears." He goes on to relate the experience of one Curtus Rufus. This story is also told by Tacitus in the Annals, who, when on duty in Africa, was one day walking up and down the colonnade of his house. During his perambulation, there came an apparition, the figure of a woman of superhuman size and beauty. She claimed to be the spirit of Africa, who would foretell his future. Predictions promptly followed and proven true. Rather more interesting is his tale of a haunted house in Athens. Here we find several of the standard constituents of the traditional ghost story. It was a large house with a sinister reputation for being dangerous to its occupants. At the dead of night there would be heard a clanking of iron and the rattling of chains. Before the terrified inhabitants there would then appear a filthy and emaciated spectre of an old man with fetters on his legs and chains on his wrists. Those who tried to live in the house were so frightened they could not sleep. Lack of sleep plus fear and anxiety made them ill, so the house was deserted but was advertised for sale or to be let, in case someone could be found who knew nothing of the ghost. Pliny's other story, rather less detailed, concerns one of his freedmen. Very different from these, and much more detailed, is the story relating to the Grettir saga, anonymous and first written down in the 12th century. The events are slightly reminiscent of those that befell Hrothgar in Hergot in Beowulf, when first Grendel and then Grendel's dam best the great stronghold. Thorhall's farm was haunted by a dangerous and malevolent troll which did a great deal of damage. In desperation to protect his flocks and his men, Thorhall hired a shepherd named Glam, a huge unkempt man with a shock of hair and great grey staring eyes uncanny to look on. Glam was a success, but eventually the troll got the better of him and killed him. In due course, the all-too-solid ghost of Glam began to haunt the farm, marauding and plundering. Thorhall hired another shepherd, Thorgalt, to guard the flocks, but he too met a bloody and terrible end. Glam's depredations became worse. Eventually the warrior Grettir the Strong heard of the haunting at Thorhall's stead and went to visit Thorhall. The farmer was enormously pleased to have a warrior's protection. The climax came with the epic wrestling between Grettir and Glam. Grettir, almost at his last gasp, just had strength enough to draw his sword and behead the dreadful ghost, but not before Glam had laid his weird upon him. Ever after, Grettir saw strange shapes in the dark, and all sorts of horrors disturbed his sleep. And often he saw before him Glam's rolling glassy eyes. It is characteristic of all epics, especially that in the oral tradition, from Gilgamesh to the South Slav Nuruddin Pessim, that men are 10 or more feet tall. The ghosts are in the same heroic mould. Much different is the scale of Chaucer, who includes 2 insect stories, both originally related by Cicero and Valerius, in the Nun's Priest's Tale. They are part of Chanticleer's long disquisition on dreams, and in each case depend on the dream convention so popular in the Middle Ages. And they are tantalizing because they make one wonder what Chaucer might have made of a full-length ghost story, perhaps a comic one from a pilgrim. In the first, 2 companions arrive in a town where they have a great difficulty in finding accommodation. In the end, one dosses in an ox stall belonging to the inn, the other finds separate lodging. The latter dreams twice that he hears his friend calling for help, crying out that he is going to be murdered for his money. The third time he dreams that the bloody vision of his friend appears and explains that he has been murdered. The spectre enjoins his sleeping comrade to rise early the next morning and go to the west gate of the town. Cart full of dung there shall see, in which my body is hid full privily. Do the like cart arrest him boldly. And so it turns out, and the carter and the innkeeper are tried and hanged. In the second, 2 men are planning a sea voyage. During the night before embarkation, one of them has a dream vision. A figure at his bedside warns him not to sail the next day, otherwise he will be drowned. He decides to trust the premonition, but his friend, derisive of the experience, sails, and sure enough, the ship sinks and all are drowned. The French chronicler Jean Froissart, a well-travelled man and an assiduous gatherer of information, was almost an exact contemporary of Chaucer. His Chroniquette, which covers the period 1325 to 1400, contains 2 quite long and rather strange ghost stories. They are fashioned in such detail, with such skill — Froissart was a literary artist as much as he was an historian — that one might think that here is a modern ghost story almost fledged. But it was to be still another 400 years before that fledging took place. The haunting of Sir Peter occurs in Book 3, which is denoted to the years 1386 to 1388, just when Chaucer was on course with the Canterbury Tales. Sir Peter of Bern took to walking in his sleep and feared to sleep alone. When he rose at night to sleepwalk, he armed himself and engaged in duels with an imaginary assailant, much to the alarm of his servants, who had orders to wake him. His peculiar behaviour was associated with the pursuit and killing of a huge and dangerous bear, which had killed and maimed several of his hounds. Having dispatched the bear with his sword, Sir Peter had returned to his castle in Biscay. As soon as his wife saw the dead bear, she fainted, and shortly after, on the pretext of making a pilgrimage with her children, took refuge with the King of Castile. The reason for her fear was that her father had once hunted the same bear, and had heard a disembodied saying, "You hunt me, though I mean you no harm, you will come to an evil end." In fact, he did come to such an end. The king had him beheaded, and now Sir Peter was haunted by a phantom assailant in the night. Froissart's other story, which belongs to the same period, is more complex. It is called The Tale of the Familiar, and has some comic aspects to it. There is also an element of diablerie and suggestions that the haunted spirits are some form of poltergeist. Pope Urban V gave a judgment in Avignon in favour of a priest to tithe in the domain of Raymond, Seigneur of Courcey. The seigneur refused to abide by the judgment and sent the cleric packing. On departure, the priest gave a solemn warning. "As soon as I can, I shall send you a champion who will frighten you more than I do." The baron scoffed, but about 3 months later, strange disturbances began in his castle. There were loud knockings, bangings, and bumps. His wife was terrified, and so were the servants. However, the baron, who feared little or nothing, began to have conversations with one of the visitants, who was named Orton. Eventually, he persuaded Orton to leave the service of the priest and work on his behalf. Thereupon, Orton became a kind of spook informant and spy, bringing the baron details of events in various parts of Europe. It continued for 5 or 6 years. The baron became increasingly curious to see the embodiment of his familiar. At last, Orton agreed to materialize, but wouldn't divulge what form he would assume. One morning, the baron saw an enormous sow in his courtyard, but it was so thin it was nothing but skin and bone, with great long teats dangling under it and a long, hungry-looking snout. He ordered his dogs to drive it off. Too late he realized who the sow was. Orton never returned to the castle, and the baron died within a year. These few instances reveal some of the possibilities of the ghost story as envisaged by earlier writers, and they prefigure the fictional creations of the 19th and 20th centuries. During the Renaissance period in Europe and England, and until near the end of the 17th century, there were widespread and often erudite and scholarly interest in supernatural matters and the occult sciences, especially in demonology, black magic, witchcraft, and necromancy. By the mid-17th century, there was copious literature on these subjects. It was a product of a continuous inquiry, as it were, into the preternatural, much of which latterly had tended to come under the heading of what is now known as paranormal. By 1650, that inquiry had gone on for hundreds of years, and if we look back no earlier than the 11th century, we find from then on a succession of formidable men who applied their keen intellects to a wide range of knowledge and speculation, sometimes at their own peril and the danger of others. Such a man, for instance, is Michael Silius, professor of philosophy at the University of Constantinople, who among many published in 1050 a learned treatise on demons with special reference to their energy. And there was Peter Lombard, author of the famous Liber Centenarium, Roger Bacon, John Bromyard, Chancellor of Cambridge University, who wrote Summa Praedictorium, a major theological handbook, Cornelius Agrippa, author of De Occulta Philosophia, Paracelsus, the founder of modern chemistry, who was an expert on magic, alchemy, and astrology, Robert Flood, the physician and Rosicrucian, and those two notorious Dominican witch hunters, Sprengler and Cranmer, authentic forerunners of Senator McCarthy's zealous hatchetmen, who complied with the sinister Malus Maleficarium. To these one might add Wyer, Bodin, Regemius, and Dirio, all of whom wrote on the matter of demonology and magic, and a lawyer who compiled his celebrated Histoire des Spectres in 1605. All these scholars, and many others, were interested in psychic phenomenon and thus ghosts, but it was the Tudor and Jacobean dramatists who perceived the rich possibilities of using ghosts as characters in their plays. In doing so, they were considerably influenced by Seneca's tragedies. For example, Agamemnon, in which the ghost of Theseus delivers the prologue, and Theistus with the prologue ghost of Tantalus. In his plays, the revengers are sometimes urged on by the hallucination that they see the spirits of the dead. There are literally scores of ghosts in many hundreds of plays written and produced between 1580 and 1620. They are particularly prominent in chronicle and history plays, and in the tragedies and revenge tragedies. Some are malignant and vengeful, some have an important part to play in the plot, some have premonitory roles, and some have walk-on parts, so to speak, to give the audience an additional shudder. Thereafter, the stage ghost was to have a variable history. It never had a place in comedy, but it thrived on melodrama in the 19th century and is by no means defunct today. With the exception of the stage spook, ghosts virtually disappeared from European literature in the course of the first half of the 17th century, and they do not reappear until the advent of the Gothic story in the later part of the 18th century. However, they are mentioned with some frequency in works pertaining to supernatural matters. There is little fading of their activity and presence in oral tradition, in ballad and folklore, and in folksong and popular superstition, and also in more durable forms of stories and poems printed in broadsheets and chapbooks. Some of the best ghost stories have in fact lived in the predominantly bold and concise form of the traditional ballad. In 1706, Defoe published his celebrated A True Relation of the Apparition of one Mrs. Veal. This arose from a strange incident of a haunting in Canterbury, which Defoe investigated personally by going to see Mrs. Bargrave, the chief witness. As one might expect from Defoe, it is a vivid piece of writing. It is journalism rather than fiction, but one can see easily enough how it might be made into a ghost story of the kind that became popular in the 19th century. Defoe wrote it plumb in the middle of the Augustan age, taken narrowly by Goldsmith to be the period of Queen Anne, the age of reason and neoclassicism, when the prime literary and aesthetic virtues were good sense, order, harmony, restraint, elegance, and decorum. Literate and educated people were disinclined to believe in ghosts. When such a matter was raised, the attitude towards it would be one of urbane and mildly amused skepticism and condescension. In the 1740s, there began to develop a marked shift in sensibility. This was signalled by those who came to be called graveyard poets. Graveyard poetry displayed a preoccupation with death, suffering, and the sepulchral. It also challenged rationalism and was fundamentally different in tone, mood, and theme from anything that Pope and his fellow Augustans had approved and advocated. The main poems were Edward Young's Night Thoughts, Blair's The Grave, and James Hervey's Meditations Among the Tombs. Some would add Gray's Elegy, but there was also Thomas Warton's On the Pleasures of Melancholy. Such writings had pronounced influence on the Gothic novel, which was shortly to appear, and with it, the ghost in fiction. They also had a profound effect on German writers of terror fiction at the turn of the 18th century. Most Gothic novels were tales of mystery and terror intended to chill the spine and curdle the blood. They contained strong elements of the supernatural and the now traditional props of the haunted house, a sight exploited ad nauseum in cinema in much third-rate fiction. They are often set in medieval castles which have secret passages, dungeons, perilous staircases, torture chambers, and a more than adequate complement of spooky happenings and spectres. One of the earliest examples of the genre is Smollett's Ferdinand Count Fathom, perhaps the first novel to propose terror and cruelty as its main themes. Much better known than this, and much more influential, was Horace Walpole's The Castle at Ontaro. He wrote this in his house at Strawberry Hill in Twickenham, where he had made his abode into a little Gothic castle. Barely readable today, merely for diversion, it was a tale of villainy, blood, and passion, and included a monstrous ghost. It was an immensely popular book and believed to have gone through 115 editions since it first appeared. In the next 50 years or so, there came a succession of such castles of varying quality, not a few of which were dramatized. Some of the major examples of the genre were Thomas Leyland's Longsword, Clara Reeve's The Old English Baron, William Beckford's Vark, Anne Radcliffe's The Mystery of Udolpho, and of course we can't forget Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and William Godwin's Caleb Williams, which are all often grouped under the Gothic heading, but certainly in the case of Caleb Williams, has a particular importance as an early instance of a propaganda novel and a novel of crime and detection. During the same period, German writers were developing their own brand of sensational and Gothic fiction, and this is of some importance because of the initial German contribution to the ghost story. During the 18th century, German literary circles displayed great interest in English literature. Klopstock, Gurlitt, and Wieland, for instance, were much influenced by Shakespeare, Milton, and Richardson, and also by Edward Young and James Hervey. Goethe even thought that Young was on par with Milton. There was corresponding English interest in German literature. They interacted. Monk Lewis, for example, was well read in German literature, a talented translator, and was to influence E.T.A. Hoffmann. Translation of German terror fiction began in 1794 with the appearance of an English rendering of Benedict Naubert's Hermann von Unna. A series of translations followed, featured a number of very popular German authors, which proved very popular, and perhaps it was Schiller's play Die Räuber, translated in 1792, that was perhaps the most important of all. But there were major differences between German and English practitioners of the Gothic. The German fictional heroes were political, there was overt social comment, and anti-clericalism was clearly voiced. Schiller, especially, was an advocate of the individual against the social convention and taboo. The Richter und Rabenmann and the Schauermann, counterparts of the English Gothic, were an aspect of the Sturm und Drang revolutionary literary movement. Elsewhere in Europe, many people read such fiction and there was a big demand for it. However, except in France, few writers were inspired to emulate, develop, or exploit the Gothic style and tradition. In France, English Gothic novels were widely read and imitated. The influence of these, plus that of the German Gothic, more particularly the tales of Hoffmann, was to be felt in French literature until at least the 1880s. The Gothic style also travelled to America, where Isaac Mitchell achieved some reputation with The Asylum, and Charles Brockden Brown, America's first man of letters, attained something approaching fame with such Gothic romances as Wieland, Arthur Mervyn, Ormond, and Edgar Huntly. The main influences on him were Richardson, Goodwin, and Anne Radcliffe. In turn, Browne was to influence Hawthorne and Poe, and also several English writers, notably Keats, Sir Walter Scott, Hazlitt, Mary Shelley, and Shelley himself, who, according to Peacock, and in the view of their closeness, their friendship, Peacock would certainly have known, was deeply involved with Browne's work. This kind of cross-pollination was to continue for a long time during the 19th century, and the Gothic type of tale in various forms was not only vigorously alive at the end of the century, but was to receive further expression in the cinema, and from the 1950s onwards in fictional horror stories. Among British and German writers, the influence has been diachronic. The Americans are best exemplified by Hawthorne, Poe, and Ambrose Bierce in the 19th century, later by H.P. Lovecraft, John Hawkes, Jane Pundy, and Thomas Pynchon. Poe, at his worst or at his best, remains most widely known. At the outset of the 19th century, the then newly emergent form of the novella, as conceived by Goethe, coincided with the advent of the short story. The short story had been there in embryo, as it were, all along. Its forefather, however rude in some cases, were myth, legend, parable, fairy story, fable, exemplarium, and even the ballad. The account of Cain and Abel, Ruth, Judith, Susanna, the prodigal son are all short stories. Rather suddenly, and perhaps a little unexpectedly, not only do we find the short story in a well-advanced state of development, we also find the ghost story as a short story in the works of Kleist and Hoffmann. But the ground has been prepared, if somewhat haphazardly. One might even go so far as to suggest that the atmosphere in the opening years of the 19th century was absolutely right for that of the ghost story. One may adduce various possible causes and reasons for this state of readiness. For between 40 and 50 years, the Gothic tale in its various forms and terror fiction had helped to condition the reading public to the idea and the use of the supernatural and quasi-supernatural forces and agencies. It had also accustomed them to being frightened. But there were, I believe, a variety of more specific influences which contributed to the making of people susceptible and receptive to a new kind of ghost story. For example, there was the marked interest in the concept of evil and the operations of the devil himself. The Faust theme was revived and was to be persistently attractive to writers and composers in the 19th century, and so was the disturbing legend of the Wandering Jew. There was a widespread study of folklore and ballads. This had been going on since the middle of the 18th century, both of which are good sources of ghost lore and tales. In addition, there was a sensational interest in the darker features of the Middle Ages, already manifest in Gothic tales, a growing curiosity about superstition, a renewal of interest in mysticism, and a noticeable preoccupation with the dual nature of man, hence a series of split personality and doppelganger stories. The particular failure of Orthodox Christian belief and practice may have encouraged superstitions. Nor can we discount the effect of pseudo-magi such as Cagliostro and Saint Germain. Finally, there were the influential writings of Johann Hamann, who vigorously supported the operation of intuition and instinct as opposed to reason, and the much more potent views of Swedenborg on psychic phenomenon and the workings of the spirit. It is noticeable, too, that major poets were attracted to the possibilities of magic and the supernatural in their narrative. Subsequently, supernatural narrative in verse, as well as prose, was prominent in English and European literature throughout the 19th century. As far as the advent of the ghost story is concerned, it seems at any rate plausible that people were beginning to feel the need for something more sophisticated and, in a sense, realistic. After 50 years of Gothic extravagance, there were signs that enough had been as good as a feast. At the very least, there was need for some variety. In her droll manner, Jane Austen had suggested as much in Northanger Abbey, which was begun in 1798 and prepared for the press in 1803. In 1818, too, Peacock published Nightmare Abbey, which benevolently pokes fun at the Gothic excesses and has a hilarious chapter on the subject of ghosts, plus a ghost of suitably bloody and spectral appearance. However, on the whole, terror fiction was taken rather seriously, partly, no doubt, because, as Jane Austen had implied, it had little or nothing to do with reality. In 1890, Leigh Hunt remarked in his introduction to A Tale from a Chimney Corner, A man who does not contribute his quota of grim stories nowadays seems hardly to be free of the Republic of Letters. He is bound to wear a death's head as part of his insignia. If he does not frighten everyone, he is nobody. If he does not shock the ladies, what can be expected of him? Moreover, the publication in 1818 of John Polidori's The Vampire reflected a renewed interest in vampirism, which grew steadily during the 19th century. Not a few writers were attracted to it as a subject for their tales. However right the atmosphere may have been, the fact remains that at the start of the century we find a most carefully wrought fictional ghost story. Heinrich von Kleist's The Woman of Locarno, published in 1810 and again in 1811. It is very short, some 800 words, but contains in that small body several of the constituents of a traditional ghost story in a highly concentrated form. The dwelling place, in this instance a castle, which comes to be haunted and is thus difficult to sell, the erring owner who is guilty of starting the chain of events, the terrified wife, the visitor who is afraid, the dog that senses the presence of preternatural forces, the themes of guilt and retribution. It is written beautifully and with the utmost economy. One is tempted to think that the story might have been a draft for something more ambitious. It is easy to see how and where Kleist might have amplified it. All the characters, including the dog, could have been developed. The basic events might have been elaborated. The suspense and tension could have been protracted. Much more might have been made of the conclusion, which is abrupt to the point of seeming impatience. 800 words might easily have become 8,000. By contrast, a few years later, in 1817, there is E.T.A. Hoffmann's very long story, The Entail. It is 30 times longer than Kleist, and with the notable exception of Henry James's The Turn of the Screw, is probably the longest short story in existence which involves a ghost. Hoffmann has that strong sense of the past which was to become central to the evolution of the ghost story during the next 100 years, and he achieves much more than the tale of a haunted castle. He creates a microcosm which has deep roots in custom, attitude, taboo, social convention, and family relationships. And he gives himself ample time and space in which to create and develop several characters. The build-up of a somber and sinister atmosphere is gradual, so is the elaboration of tension and uncertainty. These are offset by an ironical tone and occasional moments of sardonic humour. Had Kleist and Hoffmann been writing at a time when the ghost story was well established, say in the 1870s, and there were more numerous precedents, their achievements would have been far less remarkable. But they were pioneers who started from scratch, so to speak, producing two superlative ghost stories, although these were by no means their only excursion into the supernatural, and made major contribution to the creation of the short story, then scarcely heard of. The odd part about it is that from then on and up to the present day, German writers have made a minimal contribution to the genre of the ghost story, which has been dominated by British writers, especially the English. But if you do a quantitative survey, you will find something like 98% of ghost stories are in English and about 70% of those are by English writers. Why should this be? Is in itself an interesting question. The first ghost story of importance by an American author was The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving, a humorous tale and a very well-written one. Like Hoffmann, Irving seems to need the space to develop the character and prepare for his comic effect. It was published in The Sketchbook in 1820, accompanied by The Spectre Bridegroom, a more sinister tale. Both clearly show German influence, and the latter is set in Germany. Sir Walter Scott's Red Gauntlet, a novel published in 1820, contained one of the best ghost stories, The Wandering Willie's Tale, which incorporates elements from legend and shows a fine grasp of structure and logic in the combination of natural and supernatural events, greatly enriched by Scott's masterly use of bordered dialect, and also a certain sardonic humour. His other two ghost stories were The Tapestried Chamber and My Aunt Margaret's Mirror, first both published in The Keepsake in 1828. He also wrote an essay on the supernatural in fictitious composition in 1827, which displays a very shrewd understanding of what can and cannot be done in the genre. Perhaps his most telling observation is, the supernatural is peculiarly subject to be exhausted by coarse handling and repeated pressure. It is also of character which is extremely difficult to sustain, and of which a very small proportion may be said to be better than the whole. Many ghost stories and many a horror story fail precisely because of coarse handling and repeat pressure, and because of attempts to sustain suspense too long. Only a handful of writers have ever succeeded in the long ghost story and the long horror story. Even over a short distance, the casualty rate is high, as illustrated all too well by some of the works, for instance, of Edgar Allan Poe, F. Marion Crawford, W. W. Jacobs, and H. P. Lovecraft. It was in the 1830s that Edgar Allan Poe began to make his impact. His first collection of short stories, The Grotesque and Arabesque, appeared in 1840. His influence on the evolution of the short story, ghost and horror and suspense in particular, was considerable, and perhaps not entirely for the good of some writers. It persisted through the 19th century in the works of the French symbologists and such English writers as Rossetti, Swinburne, Dawson, and Stevenson, and later in such Americans as Ambrose Bierce, Hart Crane, H. P. Lovecraft. Poe, in his turn, has been influenced by Hoffman. As a commercial writer, he understood well what he was aiming at. In his piece How to Write a Blackwood Article, he advised new contributors thus: "Sensations are the great things after all. Should you ever be drowned or hung, be sure to make a note of your sensations. They will be worth your 10 guineas a sheet." It can be easily said that Poe is somewhat overrated, although it is almost certainly heresy to say so. Moreover, his best stories are not ghost stories. They are horror and suspense stories. A lesser contemporary talent was that of the English parson R. H. Barham, who made some contribution to the development of the ghost story in the 1830s. He was an accomplished versifier and a skillful and witty practitioner of the light verse, and he wrote several good ghost stories in verse. He also wrote 2 long ones in prose, The Spectre of Tappington and The Leech of Folkestone. Much of his work was published in Bentley's Miscellany and reissued in 1840 in the collection which was to become popular for 100 years or more, the Ingoldsby Legends. In 1834, Alexander Pushkin published The Queen of Spades, the story of the young gambler and the aged countess who visits him after her murder. It differs from most other ghost stories of note, since the spirit of the old noblewoman appears at the very end to resolve the plot and finally causes the young gambler to be deceived at a game of cards, the loss of which drives him completely insane. In Russian literature, it is something of an odd one out and isolated and brilliant phenomenon. A few Russian writers have composed ghost stories which make extensive use of supernatural elements. By 1840, Charles Dickens, still only in his 20s, had become famous, and his influence on the ghost story was to be of the utmost importance. He more than anyone associated such tales with Christmas. He was familiar with the traditional customs such as telling stories around the fireside, and with that folklore in which ghosts are linked with Christmas Eve. Moreover, he very much enjoyed writing about Christmas. His earliest ghost stories were inset tales in the Pickwick Papers, published in 1837. There followed A Christmas Carol in 1843, in which Old Marley is the first of a series of apparitions. Then came a succession of Christmas books: The Chimes in 1840, The Cricket on the Hearth in 1845, The Battle of Life in 1846, and The Haunted Man in 1848. Of his later ghost stories, the 2 best known were written especially for Christmas issues of his magazine all the year round. They are usually known as The Trial for Murder and Number 1 Branch Line, The Signalman. Dickens' contribution to the development of the ghost story is not confined to his own works. In 1851, he initiated a special supplement to his magazine Household Words, to which he invited writers to submit seasonal offerings. The 1852 supplement, entitled A Round of Christmas Stories by the Fire, included Elizabeth Gaskell's splendid The Old Nurse's Story. From 1854, the framework for the tales became more elaborate. In 1859, he closed Household Words and started All the Year Round. Again, there were Christmas supplements with common theme, and ghost stories were a popular feature. In the 1860s and 1870s, many ghost story writers were women, amongst whom we should mention particularly Amelia Edwards, Rosa Mulholland, Mrs. Brandon, Mrs. Riddle, and Mrs. Oliphant. Thackeray tried his hand at the genre with The Story of Mary Ansell, and Wilkie Collins was prolific. In 1856, he published After Dark and Other Stories in 2 volumes. In 1859, Queen of Hearts in 3 volumes. And in 1879, Little Novels. Collins collaborated with Dickens and contributed to his magazine. Bulwer-Lytton also wrote ghost stories, of which the best known are The Haunters and the Haunted from 1859, commissioned by Dickens, and A Strange Story in 1861. Ultimately, more famous than these as a practitioner of the form was Sheridan Le Fanu, who M.R. James considered in the first rank as a writer of ghost stories. By the time Le Fanu died in 1873, the genre was fully established. It was to continue to burgeon for the next 100 years. Le Fanu's first ghost story dates from between 1838 and 1840. In the next 30 years, he wrote a great many, showing a particular gift for depicting states of guilt and fear. His ghosts are uncannily real and convincing. Among the best-known stories are Mr. Justice Harbottle, Green Tea, The Familiar, and Carmilla. During the second half of the 19th century, there was a growing and increasingly widespread interest in psychic phenomena, in the psychotherapy, and extreme psychological states, and in spiritualism. F.W.H. Myers, who was deeply interested in Mesmer's theories, helped found the Society for Psychical Research. Drugs and their effects, duality and double identity, dreams, madness, diabolism and diabolic pacts, black magic and witchcraft also exercised people's curiosity. In view of all this activity and inquiry, it is no way surprising that ghosts should continue to fascinate. Ghost stories proliferated. From the 1870s onwards, there were scores of them. It is almost as if they were beginning to fulfill a kind of spiritual need. As if the possibility of ghosts was a reassurance of an afterlife. Besides, ghosts were a link to the past, with tradition between the living and the dead. Moreover, writers do not seem to have regarded their ghost stories and other tales of the supernatural as mere diversions and entertainment. They had serious intentions, including exploring states of consciousness, examining aspects of appearance and reality, investigating the very meaning of existence. I mentioned earlier that very few European writers showed any interest in the ghost story. Fortunately for us, de Maupassant was one of them. He wrote several memorable and frightening tales, including La Horla and Was It a Dream in 1887, The Apparition and Who Knows in 1890 as well. La Horla, which translates as Out There, is the most famous of his psychological ghost stories. A little later, Émile Zola wrote Angeline, so far as I know, his only attempt at a ghost story. It derived from his so-called exile in England in 1898 to 1899, where he lived near Weybridge in Surrey. During a bicycle ride, he discovered an abandoned house which had a legend to it. He transposed the setting to his native France and wrote a story in October of 1898. During the last 20-odd years of the 19th century, the Americans Ambrose Bierce and O. Henry were publishing their short ghost stories. Outstanding among Bierce's tales are The Middle Toe of the Right Foot and An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, both published in 1891, and The Moonlit Road in 1894. O. Henry is chiefly remembered for The Furnished Room of 1906. At this period, too, Bernard Lee was making some idiosyncratic contributions. Her major collection, Hauntings Fantastic Stories, published in 1890, included 3 of her best known, A Mordieu, Oak of Oakhurst, and A Wicked Voice. She was considerably influenced by Nathaniel Hawthorne, more especially by his novel The Marbled Fool. Her rather obsessive interest in the past was characteristic of some writers of the period. Few writers have possessed a keener and more delicately subtle and pervasive sense of the past than Henry James, who was also much affected by the Marble Fool, as he frequently revealed, not least in his unfinished novel The Sense of the Past from 1917, which is concerned with a form of haunting about which perhaps nobody but James could have written. He had begun writing ghost stories back in the 1860s when Dickens and Le Fanu were still alive, and 40 years later he was still experimenting. In his first 2, The Romance of Certain Old Clothes in 1868 and De Grey, A Romance of 1868, Hawthorne's influence is apparent. Later, amongst others, came Owen Wingrave, Sir Edmund Home, The Passionate Pilgrim, The Jolly Corner in 1808, and what most people regard as his masterpiece in the genre, The Turn of the Screw in 1898. James achieved his effect by hint and suggestion, by a kind of stealth. The stories are more interesting than most because the situation he invents and the characters he creates occupy one's full attention. The actual ghost may be of subsidiary importance. In the late 1890s, M.R. James began to write his celebrated ghost stories. They were written to be read aloud, usually to friends at Christmas time. He has the distinction of being the most anthologized writer of all ghost stories, and he is very probably the only writer of short stories to have concentrated exclusively on ghosts. Not that there are a great many of them. James was a student of the 19th century ghost story. He must have read hundreds, and shows thoroughly professional approach to the craft of writing them. He worked out his own rules, which appear in brief prefaces to his collections of tales. He liked a setting that was fairly familiar, and characters and talk of the kind you might come across every day. As he put it in his introduction to Ghosts and Marvels, let us then be introduced to the actors in a placid way. Let us see them going about their ordinary business, undisturbed by forebodings, pleased with their surroundings, and into this calm environment let the ominous thing put out its head, unobtrusively at first, and then more insistently, until it holds the stage. With M.R. James, everything is subordinate to the plot. He was an expert plotter. Nevertheless, there is a great deal of body to his stories. He is very good indeed at invoking locale and atmosphere in the careful description of buildings. His massive erudition is kept under careful control and is always functional. His characters are, in E.M. Foster's term, flat rather than round. This is true of most characters in ghost stories, but not quite so flat and transparent as some have made out. He has a knack for producing a personality quick through description and speech. Dialogue is one of his strong points. He has a good ear for the spoken word. In fact, he was a talented mimic. And he also has a good ear and eye for the pastiche in Latin as well as English. Above all, he has the imponderable quality of style. His relaxed but elegant prose is continually pleasing. James's best efforts are achieved by meiosis and the quiet tone. He works away stealthily on the reader's nerves and can be genuinely frightening. It is hardly surprising that he is the only writer of ghost stories whose collected works have remained continuously in print. Like Henry James, but in a different way, he has a profound and sensitive awareness of the past and adapted a number of themes from legend, ballad, and myth. Everybody has a favourite M.R. James story. Among the very well known are A School Story, Oh Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad, Casting the Runes, Martin's Close, and The Ash Tree. Algernon Blackwood was an almost exact contemporary of M.R. James, although he lived some years longer. Unlike James, he was seriously interested in psychic phenomena and wrote some powerful stories with supernatural themes. Particularly well known are Ancient Sorceries and Secret Worship. His first collection in this genre, The Empty House and Other Ghost Stories, was published in 1906 and was followed by one of my personal favourites, John Silence, Physician Extraordinaire, in 1908. He remained interested in the occult for most of his life. Another near contemporary was William Hope Hodgson. His parapsychologist Carnacki differed from John Silence in that he used equipment and instruments to track down spirits. Some of the tales are ingenious, but Hodgson was not a very good writer. He would overdo it. Yet another long-lived contemporary was the prolific Arthur Machen, much influenced by Stevenson, who experimented with a variety of supernatural tales, including Great God Pan, The Innermost Light in 1895, Three Impostors in 1895, and The House of Souls in 1906. The Benson brothers, A.C., E.F., and R.H., sons of the Archbishop of Canterbury, all published stories about ghosts and the supernatural at the turn of the 19th century. A.C. Benson's work is seldom read now, but some of the tales of Robert Hughes Benson, a priest deeply interested in the occult, spiritualism, and necromancy, have survived. E.F. Benson had a long and successful career as a novelist and short story writer. He excelled at ghost stories and, like M.R. James, adhered to a fairly definite rule set. He is seldom less than competent and at his best rivals masters of the form. For much of the 20th century, he has been a favourite among schoolboys. Also before the First World War, we have the examples of Oscar Wilde's delightfully comic tale, The Canterville Ghost, which has been a perennial favourite ever since, W. Jacobs' terrifying The Monkey's Paw from 1902, a standby to anthologists for many years now, Oliver Onion's The Beckoning Fair One of 1911, Sake's spoof ghost story The Open Window, and some tales in E.M. Foster's The Celestial Omnibus of 1911. Between the wars, the ghost story continued to flourish, though not with the style, vigour, variety and originality of the years between, say, 1850 and 1910. In the early days of broadcasting in the 1920s, A.J. Allen made a very idiosyncratic contribution. He worked for the Foreign Office and made his broadcasts in evening dress. He became a rather well-known raconteur of his own works, subsequently gathered in the Good Evening Everyone in 1928 and A.J. Allen's second book in 1933. His style was relaxed to the point of fastidiousness and casualness, all most carefully contrived. The stories were neat, low-toned, disarmingly guileful. Among the better-known ones are The Hare, The Diver, and My Adventures in Norfolk. And of course, from the interwar period, I have to mention H.P. Lovecraft, a specialist in tales of horror who also wrote some ghost stories of variable quality. The skeletal shadow of Poe was inclined to lie somewhat broadly over him, and he was venerable to that coarse handling and repetitive pressure which Scott had acutely perceived to be harmful to supernatural tales. On the other hand, Elizabeth Bowen, during the same period and later, wrote a number of ghost stories of notable merit. Some of the best were eventually collected in The Demon Lover, published in 1945. The First World War profoundly modified people's feelings in respect of that of death, ghosts, and ghost stories. A cataclysm produced tens of thousands of ghosts, the missing, the believed killed in action, the walking wounded of a spectral no-man's land, who were to haunt the memories of Europe for years. The Second World War vastly increased their ranks. Death was in ascendancy on a scale not witnessed since the great plagues of the 14th and 15th centuries. For many, a ghost story might have been a little too near the bone for diversion, or, after all the actualities of fear and terror, too trivial. Nor can one overlook the powerful influence of Freud and his followers, which caused people to consider the operations of the unconscious and to think differently about inner fears and inhibitions. I remarked earlier that ghost stories have been dominated by British writers, and particularly by the English. It is also worth noting that in oral tradition and popular belief there is a very extensive ghost lore in Britain, which is being added to all the time. There are guidebooks of the ghosts of individual counties and regions, detailed studies of particular places and their spooks, historical surveys, case histories, ghost hunters' manuals, and even maps showing population density of ghosts. From a perusal of these books, I infer the murder, suicide, and execution have been the main begetters of restless haunted spirits and the stories that go with them. In Greater London alone, there are about 100 tolerably well-known ghost stories associated with particular people and places. If we consider England and Wales alone, there are well over 500 prominent ghosts with definitive identity whose collective spectral existence span more than 1,000 years. Apart from rural ghosts connected with specific stretches of the countryside, there are a multitude of haunted castles, houses, theatres, inns, courtrooms, jails, railway stations, quays, streets, churches, farms, banks, warehouses, and where not, of course, graveyards and sites where giblets formerly stood. As to personalities, we not only have monarchs and members of the nobility and aristocracy, but large numbers of more or less illustrious spectres who would have entries in any reputable Who's Who. You've got Bishop Lancelot Andrewes, Fred Archer, Thomas à Becket, Jeremy Bentham, Emily Bronte, to name just a few. One of the most venerable British ghosts is that of King Athelstan, whose haunting of Dacre Castle in Cumbria dates to the middle of the 10th century. In the world of the supernatural, inanimate objects too are capable of uncanny behaviour. For example, the famous ghost train of Box Tunnel in Wiltshire, the Phantom Spitfire of Biggin Hill, and the Phantom Fiddle of Poole in Dorset. Horses and dogs are especially conspicuous in ghost lore. The horses, headless or otherwise, are nearly always associated with human ghosts. Dogs often have more individual and separate existences, like the ubiquitous Black Shuck, the phantom hound cited frequently in East Anglia, and known in other regions as Shrieker, Hooter, Guy Trash, Boggle, Dobby, Barghest, Old Snarlylow, and Shugmonkey. My personal favourite non-human ghost is the Phantom Chicken of Highgate, the victim of an experiment in the theory of refrigeration conducted by Sir Francis Bacon in the winter of 1626. During a blizzard, Sir Francis went out to the duck pond on top of Highgate Hill and stuffed frozen snow into the carcass of a freshly plucked chicken. The entire enterprise was too much for Bacon. Then in his 60th year, he caught a cold, developed bronchitis and died. The spectre of the luckless fowl, featherless, squawking and agitating its stubs of wings, has ever since sporadically haunted Pond Square. Observers remark it disappears through a brick wall. Materials of legend, folklore, and oral tradition have often been exploited by writers of ghost stories, and the common stock of such material goes on accumulating. In the course of their lives, a surprising number of people have at least one experience of a sufficiently weird and uncanny nature to warrant it being associated to ghostly influence. Emotional, mental, or spiritual stress, grief, loss, pain, guilt, extreme states of mind make them particularly susceptible. The experiences may be imaginary, but they are nonetheless real for that. Ambrose Bierce was very likely right when he remarked that ghosts are the outward and visible signs of an inward fear. People go on reading ghost stories because, at a basic and perhaps somewhat childlike level, they rather enjoy being frightened. A really good ghost story is frightening. There is no doubt about that. And that is it for this one. Thank you very much, lovely listener. If you enjoyed this, please hit the thumbs up, like, subscribe, and join us on Patreon for exclusive early access and other perks. I thank you for joining me, wherever, whenever, whatever you are, and I hope you will join us for another episode in another time. Thank you, and goodbye.